Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. My name is Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. Before we get going, I want to take a moment to thank everybody who watched our debut episode a couple of weeks ago. The response we've gotten has been far beyond what we expected and overwhelming. A big thanks to Ray Betzner, who joined us in that show. And your response and your feedback has been very generous, and I want to say very much appreciated. We have a great show for you lined up now. Today, we're going to be speaking with Bob Katz, who is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. He's a great Sherlockian and a good friend. And he's also, which will be pertinent to this conversation, as you'll see, the leader of the Philadelphia-based science society, the Sons of the Copper Beeches. We talked about how in this podcast we want to explore the relationship between the Sherlockian science societies and the Baker Street Irregulars, and we're going to do a bit of that today. But mostly we're going to have a nice visit with a good friend. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Bob Katz to the show. Hello, Bob. How are you doing?
Steve, how are you? I'm doing well.
I'm doing well too. Everybody's kind of hanging in here, and we're really glad that you can join us today. This is going to be fun. I know it is.
Yeah. No, it's good to see you, even virtually.
Same here. So, Bob, tell us where you are. Where do you live?
I live in Morristown, New Jersey, which is about 30 miles west of Manhattan. It's a very old community. It goes back to before the Revolution. Those history buffs listening in will remember that Washington's army actually spent 2 winters here, both of which were less pleasant than Valley Forge, but they get the publicity. But it's a very historic town. Hamilton, Lafayette, Washington all lived here. There's a historical marker at the end of my street indicating that Washington and Lafayette passed that point on their way back from the Battle of Princeton. So it's very possible that they rode their horses across my front lawn. It's a nice town, and I came here for professional reasons. It's a really good hospital, and I've been on the staff there for many years. And in terms of what we'll talk about a little later, the Sons of the Copper Beeches, it's about 100 miles north of Philadelphia.
Great. Let's talk about your history as a Sherlockian. When did you discover Sherlock Holmes?
I was about 12. In fact, I'm certain I was 12 because I was 12. It was a rainy afternoon. I'd heard of Sherlock Holmes. You know, everybody had heard he was a famous detective, but that was really all I knew. I don't think I'd ever read a story. I remember it was a rainy afternoon, and I turned on a local television station on a Saturday. I had no place to go, and they were showing The House of Fear with Basil Rathbone. And I thought it was the greatest thing I'd ever seen. And it's actually not one of the better movies, but at the time it was great. And I literally remember leaving the house in the rain and walking to the local public library to get a Sherlock Holmes book. And that was it. And I know I was 12 because when my parents, not that long afterwards, asked me what I wanted for my 13th birthday, which, you know, in my faith is kind of a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
I told them I wanted the Doubleday complete Sherlock Holmes, which, you know, is to this day the only officially complete version. And if I wasn't already hooked by the time I'd been done with the Morley introduction, I was utterly hooked. So I really go back that far, and I've been interested and involved in it really ever since then.
Well, so you're sort of like me, kind of a lifelong Sherlockian. Talk a little bit about the groups that you belong to. I know that we're going to talk about the Sons of the Copper Beeches eventually, but what are some of the other organizations that you belong to in the Sherlockian community?
Well, currently, I'm living in the New York metro area. So for many years, I founded and chaired the Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes, which after about 28 years, we just sort of let that one take a rest for a while, although we're thinking about bringing it back. And I'm a member of the Priory Scholars in Manhattan and the Three Garrett Debs up in Westchester. And then I used to live in Baltimore, so I have some ties there, and I'm still a member of the Six Napoleons. I don't get there very often. Sherlockians of Baltimore, and then the Sons of the Copper Beeches in Philly, and the Baker Street Irregulars. And I've probably forgotten a couple of other groups that every now and then I get to, but those are kind of the most active affiliations at this point.
So let's talk about your role in the BSI. I know that you have a couple of you wear a couple of hats there. You have a special title or special designation within the organization, and you also have a leadership job within the BSI. So talk a little bit about what that is.
Well, the in terms of my major time commitment, I'm the co-publisher with John Bergquist of BSI Press, and hopefully most of the people watching are familiar with our books, the manuscript series, profession series. This is something that goes back already about 20 years, and I'm the acquisitions editor. John Bergquist is productions editor. So other than that, in the BSI, I had the title of Billy the Page. My job is to do kind of whatever odd job they need me to do. So I've taken here. Job, though. Yeah, that's really kind of what it amounts to.
We'll talk. I think in a future show we'll talk about that we're going to devote to Sherlockian publishing of all kinds. I think, and there'll be certainly a conversation in the future about BSI books. But today I kind of wanted to focus on science societies, and particularly the Copper Beeches. I have a feeling that science societies are the relationship between science societies and the BSI is an important one, and I know that a lot of Sherlockians out there in our viewership and in the Sherlockian universe are not necessarily have an understanding of how the BSI, the Baker Street Irregulars, what the relationship is. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the relationship, and but hopefully through efforts like we're doing today, we can help with a little understanding. What I want to share we got a nice note from a viewer of our previous podcast. I just want to read it because I think it goes right to the conversation we're having today. Mm-hmm. It reads, "Thank you for this," meaning the podcast. "I've been a fairly casual Holmes reader for decades and never fully understood Sterrett's significance until now." Last episode was about Vincent Sterrett. "Please do more videos about the history of Sherlockian and BSI pursuits. There are a lot of us in science societies who don't know much of the greater BSI, and this channel could do a great service in bringing us all together." And I think that was a very terrific and I mean, I was very gratified to see that because historically we have had a relationship with our sort of local and regional groups. I think that there's a lot of people who think there's sort of a top-down, command and control, but that's really not the case, is it?
No. In that sense, the BSI doesn't run the science societies, nor do the science societies have to even be officially part of the BSI. I mean, anybody can form a Sherlock Holmes club. Why not? It's a free country. But in terms of those that are called a science society, the BSI, which means you fill out some paperwork and make an application, it's not a top-down thing. To me, it's sort of a symbiotic, almost interrelationship, because one of the wisest things I ever heard about the Sherlockian world is you come for the stories and you stay for the friends. And the BSI is really a series of relationships, and that's really what it's all about. And we're all tethered to the Sherlock Holmes stories, and of course it's grown to have all these offshoots and activities, conferences and publications and so many other things. But in the end, it's a bunch of people who get together and are interested in Sherlock Holmes. And one of the ways we do that, because we only, as a BSI, we only really officially meet once a year. The other way that continues, that friendship, those relationships, are through organizations. Science societies, are to me the best example. And I guess from my own history, if it hadn't been for science societies, my whole life would have been different.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah, I when just a little bit of autobiography beyond what we already said is, after I got the complete Sherlock Holmes, by coincidence, I was at a chain of remainder bookstores in Manhattan called Marlboro Books. Anybody that grew up in New York City in the 50s and 60s will remember them. And they were all these kind of publishers overstock, sold for $1. And I was probably about 15 or 16 by then, and I came across William Baring Gould's Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street for $1. And even then, I realized it's kind of an odd book when you think about it. But the wonderful thing about that book is it's got a bibliography in the back. And he talked about things like Starrett's private life, that Ray Betzner spoke about at the last podcast he did. And he talked about the literature of Sherlock Holmes. And I actually went to public libraries because I couldn't afford to buy those books and borrowed them and had read them. And I read about science societies. And I thought, between the BSI and the science societies, what could possibly be more fun? I eventually, while I'd finished college and I was in medical school, and I came across Julian Wolfe's address somehow. In those days, they had phone books. And I ended up subscribing to the Baker Street Journal. And I remember it was January of 1974. I had learned about a meeting of what was the early version of the Three Garadebs in Westchester County. And I went to medical school in the Bronx. And I got the day off, and it was cold. It was January. And in those days, they were actually able to have a Scion meeting on the Saturday after the BSI dinner. It was up in White Plains, New York, and I traveled by a variety of subways and public transportations to White Plains, New York, to a hotel. And there was this luncheon. And I was in my early 20s, so I was still in medical school, and I met Peter Blau, and I met John Lellenberg, and I met a variety of other people. And we exchanged addresses. They were all very nice to me. They were all welcoming. And we exchanged addresses, and I started corresponding. A couple of years later, I landed in Philadelphia. And through the Baker Street Journal, I read about one group which was called, the Sons of the Copper Beeches. And I learned, though, that at that time they had a waiting list and you had to be recommended and that sort of thing. But I also read about a group which is no longer around, but was then called the Master's Class. And I really wondered, well, should I really go through this or not? And I said, all right, I'll take a chance. And at the time, I had this very rudimentary Sherlockian stationery that my mother had hand-drawn for me and photocopied, so it was really pretty basic. But I guess it showed that I was serious. And I wrote a letter introducing myself and saying I'm interested in the master's class. Well, 72 hours later, probably with the speed of the Postal Service, I got a phone call from a guy named Michael Keene, who was at that point running the master's class in Philadelphia, who could not have been more welcoming and nicer. This was 1976. And he said, by the way, we're going to have a special event a week. It's going to be a private screening of the 7% solution, which was just being released. Why don't you come? So I said, sure. Well, then I started going to their meetings. And then, as you know, Steve, because you've been through it, people are friendly. They're welcoming. I was 25, 26 years old. I was a kid. And older people old enough to be my parents were nice to me.
Oh, I know that.
Seriously.
I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's my experience too. I joined a science society when I was 15 years old. And my whole life would have been changed if they had said, no, you're too young, or no, come back. And that would have been it for me. I would have never come back probably. And you're right. I think it's been my experience that all the really, I mentioned this last week, all the real kind of daily work of the Sherlockian universe happens in the science societies. I mean, BSI meets once a year, and it's a great time. The whole weekend is very welcoming to everybody, and with all the events that go on now, but it's one weekend, and your daily Sherlockian life happens in the science societies with your fellow Sherlockians where you live. And I think it's a really important thing. I think that relationship between BSI and science societies is, like you said, it's symbiotic. It's you know it's vital, and I think membership in the BSI as a science society in relationship with the BSI kind of says we're all kind of in a like-minded universe, And,
Yeah.
And
the other thing is it's a learning experience in the sense that, it's great to be asked to talk at a BSI dinner or to give a toast, but the reality is it's only once a year, and there are only so many people that can do that. Whereas when you go to Scion meetings, there are lots of opportunities to give toasts. There are opportunities to give papers. You're stimulated to do research. So many of the things that we do as Sherlockians, I learned to do by going to Scion meetings.
Right.
I remember vividly at a meeting of the master's class, I was sitting there and Peter Blau walks by and says, "Come to Washington for the Red Circle." And I did. And it was an amazing evening because, again, I was living in Philly. I was doing my residency. I got off work early. I took the train to Washington. I showed up. And by coincidence, not the current, but the previous owner of the Charles Augustus Milverton manuscript, which BSI Press has just published as The Worst Man in London, happened to be at that Red Circle meeting, having just bought the manuscript, and he brought it to show us.
Wow.
And, it's like you travel to Washington figuring nobody's going to know you and talk to you. Well, not only was everybody very friendly and welcoming, and I made new friends, but I saw the Charles Augustus Milverton manuscript. And if you had said to me 45 years later, I'd be involved with publishing a reproduction of that manuscript as a book, I would have thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard. But that's where these things kind of begin.
Plus, just the local relationships. I mean, in my local science society, the Illustrious Clients of Indianapolis, I mean, that science society is an interrelated web of relationships and friendships that goes back decades, and that's a very rich experience. And
look, I live in New Jersey. I consider a large proportion of the people in your group in Indianapolis to be good friends of mine. The point is, we all see each other and interact with so many different things, most of which are outgrowths of Scion activities.
Yes, absolutely right. So let's talk a little bit about, let's pivot into the Scions, because I think the Scions of the Copper Beeches is a wonderful organization, and I think it's got a very unique history, and it's just, I don't know, I'm fascinated with it. I love being a member of the group. So let's talk a little bit about the Scions of the Copper Beeches.
Right. And very quickly with history, and what I'd like to do is, instead of just giving you a formal history, I kind of like to take you through a Scions of the Copper Beeches meeting. What do we do? How do we do it? What goes on?
Sounds great.
It's a group with a lot of history and tradition, which we take very seriously, while at the same time thinking it's all a big joke. So we have a lot of fun with a lot of our stuff. The way the Copper Beeches works in terms of its, quote, hierarchy is that at your first meeting, you're a guest. Your second meeting, you're called an apprentice. At your third meeting, you take what's called the Musgrave ritual, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. You become a journeyman, and then at some point, you become a master Copper Beech smith, which entitles you to write, SOCB after your name. So what's the meeting like? Well, the meetings are currently held and have been for, I guess close to 20 years now, at the Racket Club in downtown Philadelphia, which is a really nice building. The room we meet in is this kind of dark wood paneled room with a high ceiling, and I think it's got columns and vaulting and all that stuff. It's very, very old fashioned British clubby looking place. We always try to have a U-shaped table, and we meet there hopefully the last Fridays in April and October. So you get there at 6 o'clock, and there's the usual 30 minutes of mingling and having a drink and hanging out. And promptly at 6:30, Peter Blau, who is our Toastmaster and has been since prior to the age of dinosaurs, has been our Toastmaster, rings a bell. And I welcome everybody to the meeting, and I greet everybody with the traditional Sons of the Copper Beeches catchphrase, which was coined by one of our previous headmasters, Jack Coley. Welcome to the Sons of the Copper Beeches. We're alive and drinking in Philadelphia. And then Peter, as our Toastmaster, calls upon 6 people to do our traditional 6 toasts. And we always do the same 6 toasts. And we try to give the toast to people that are either first-timers or relative newcomers, or people who have traveled a rather long distance, or people who have been away for a while and now attending a meeting after several years.
It sounds like it's a way to recognize people who have...
It's a way to recognize people. It's a way to meet people, because otherwise a lot of the folks literally don't know anybody in the room. And if you can get them to do a toast, it's sort of an introduction. There are 2 things at your plate traditionally when you sit down to dinner. One is the program. And the program is this, which I don't think you can see it all that well, but it's a printed, basically, agenda, and it lists what we're doing at the meeting and the toasts and the menu and what else is going on. There's a program from the April 2019 meeting, and we did Silver Blaze. So, for example, and there are quotes for each item on the menu. Each thing we're having to eat, or each item on the program, there's a quote from the story which is appropriate. For example, it lists, Robert Katz, headmaster presiding, and then the quote from the story underneath that is, "The conversation ceased." They're very funny, they're very clever, and we have this long tradition of people not only working on these programs, and they take a lot of work, but for many years, the artwork on the cover was done initially by Ben Wolf. For many years, one of our very active members was Scott Bond, who's, of course, great illustrator for the Baker Street Journal. So he did the covers. And here's an example from, we used the cover from 2002. So here's a Scott Bond cover, very classic if you're familiar with his BSJ cartoons. The other thing that's on the table is the minutes. And it's the minutes of the previous meeting. And it's not just like a little agenda thing. This is basically a narrative that goes on 3, 4, 5 pages of what went on at the previous meeting. I always love it because, as I say, I get to find out what I said at the meeting, which I generally don't remember. It's really a nice keepsake of the event. So we start the meeting, and we have announcements and some sign reports. If there's usually a clergyman in the group, and if there's one present, we'll recite that Sherlock Holmes prayer that Chris Morley actually wrote.
I think he did.
I think he did. Yeah, Steve Rothman will tune in if I make a mistake.
Correct us if we're wrong.
Correct us. Yeah, but if we've had several clergy in the group, and they'll recite that. And to give you an idea, though, sort of the fun things that can happen at I guess was it last October? Nick Meyer was there, and Nick was doing his book tour for the Peculiar Protocols book that he'd written, and he had done an event in New York with Joel Gray, and he was going to Washington, and we knew that he had a free night that Friday night, and we said, "Come on, Nick, why don't you come to the meeting? You don't have to do anything. Just, you know a lot of the people there. Just hang out with us, and you can then next morning go up to Washington." So we did, and it was great to see Nick, but not only, even if you tell Nick not to do anything,
right?
Well, can I do a toast? So, I'm really going to tell Nicholas Meyer he can't do a toast at me. So he did a 7th toast, which was to Freud, but it was wonderful. And then we got seated.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure it was great. It was great. And then we got seated, and I happened to say, because today is Crispin's Day. This is late October, I guess. Battle of Agincourt. Mm-hmm. Nick just got up and recited from memory. Not only recited, acted out with great virtuosity the entire Henry V Band of Brothers
St. Crispin's Day
St.
speech.
Crispin's Day speech from Shakespeare's Henry V. Yeah, he just did it perfectly with no advance notice, because I just happened to say today's Crispin's Day. Up pops it. Of course, he gave it and received thunderous applause and a standing ovation. And then he just sat down and ate his dinner.
Like, as you do.
Yeah, big deal. Yeah.
Hey, Bob, let's take a break for a minute, because we have to have a message from our sponsor.
Okay. Hi, my name is Bob Katz. I'm a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and I'm the co-publisher of BSI Press. But more importantly, I'm a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal since 1973.
Hello, my name is Ralph Hall from Louisville, Kentucky. I am a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. I have subscribed to this journal I'm holding here before me, the Baker Street Journal, for 40 plus years.
Hi, I'm Monica Schmitz, and you should subscribe to the Baker Street Journal.
Hi, I'm Scott Monty from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the website and podcast about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture. The Baker Street Journal has been a wonderful sponsor of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and Trifles, our companion podcast, for many years. And when you think about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture, the Baker Street Journal has always been there.
I have literally read every issue of the Baker Street Journal since the old series in 1946.
It's full of Sherlockian scholarship and humor. The artwork on the cover is wonderful.
People take their interest from today and imbue it into the Baker Street Journal in every single issue. And if you're not subscribing, you're missing out on some of the most fascinating and lively scholarship in the Sherlockian world today.
And basically, if you don't read the Baker Street Journal, I don't know why you're being a Sherlockian.
This is where it's at.
Okay, so we're back after that break, and Bob, you were telling us about this amazing moment at the meeting when Nicholas Meyer delivered the St. Crispin's Day speech.
And then we get to eat dinner. And if we can arrange it with the catering, with the chef, we like to have black bean soup first. It's kind of a tradition. I'm not sure why, but it is. And then after dinner, we have the rest of the program. Now, in the earlier days when we were at the Orpheus Club, after dinner, before we do the Musgrave ritual, Jack Coley at the time was the head mastiff when I first joined. Jack would pass out cigars. Now, Steve, I know you're quite an expert on cigars, and when you've had events involving cigars, I'm quite sure that the cigars you've handed out are, top of the line, custom type, Havanas or whatever.
Well, we only do it once a year, so we make sure that they're quality. So
right. Well, we only do Copper Beeches twice a year, and in those days, it wasn't quality. I think the cigars were made out of tobacco, but I'm not going to vouch for that. But you've got now this narrow oblong room with a low ceiling and 60 guys who have had a fair amount to drink, all lighting up really bad cigars simultaneously. And the only outflow is this overworked little exhaust fan at the far end of the room. So
was there a smoke alarm?
Well, they didn't have them in those days, but it would have gone off. This miasma settles over the room. And in addition to having a dinner and a few drinks, I suspect that the oxygen content of the room has now diminished. But that was the kind of atmosphere that you'd get in those days. Now we're not allowed to smoke cigars.
Well, some things have certainly changed a lot.
Yeah, a lot of things have changed.
So let's talk about the big change, that happened recently. I mean, I know that the Scions, you said, started in 1947, in that, in that sort of white-hot explosion in the mid to late 40s of Scion societies that kind of sprouted all across the country. I mean, there was a great flowering of Sherlockian groups being formed, that first wave in the 40s, and the Sons of the Copper Beeches was one of them. Mm-hmm. And it was a different era. And so talk about, how it was and how it's changed?
Well, I think what you're alluding to is like a lot of those earlier Sherlockian science societies and Six Napoleons and Speckled Band up in Boston or two others, they were men only. Just were. That's how it evolved. What I think really happened was that about 9 years ago, we had a leadership change. Steve Rothman, Ray Betzner, and I ended up leading the group. And we kind of divided up the roles. Normally, the headmastiff had been pretty much in charge of everything. We decided that because we had other obligations and because also we like working with each other, that we'd divide up the tasks. And as Ray Betzner has said, we set up a governmental structure which should have failed completely and yet has worked quite well to this day, which is basically we decided any important decisions had to be made jointly. And it's just worked very well. One of the things that the three of us wanted to accomplish, really from the time we began leading the group, was to bring women in. And I think at this point we don't need to explain why, except
No, of course not.
the right thing to do. We spent a couple of years reorganizing the group, and once we felt we had a firm footing and the group was stable and running well, we just said, okay, now it's time. And in advance of one of our meetings, we sent an email to all of the, at that point, current members saying, we're going to go co-ed. We're inviting women to the next meeting. And the next day we sent out the invitations to the meeting and we invited a whole lot of women. And that's what happened. And it's been great. What I think is very important is to note that if anything, the atmosphere, which, and Steve, you've been to many meetings and correct me if I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that in many respects, the atmosphere at a Copper Beeches meeting is surprisingly close to what it might have been like at the Murray Hill Hotel in the early days of the BSI, that kind of sense of intimacy and
I think you're right.
With everybody.
The size of the group and who's next.
Size of the group, right, location, that kind of thing. There's a lot of similarity. If anything, having the women present as part of our members of our group, it certainly has enhanced that because so many of these people are friends of ours, and it's just the more friends you have, the better it is. And they're just as anxious to participate in the heckling and the raucous humor that goes along with any Sons of the Copper Beeches meeting. I mean, I'd probably get heckled.
It's a rowdy group.
It's a rowdy group. I get heckled a lot. We heckle everybody. We'll talk about the Musgrave ritual in a moment, but everybody just says what's on their mind, and it's a lot of fun. And if anything, it's gotten more raucous since then. So it was a decision that we made, and we just made it happen, and everybody's been happy. And
tell us about the Musgrave ritual, because it looms large.
Yes,
in the every meeting.
The next step after dinner is the recitation of the Musgrave ritual, and at your third meeting, you become a journeyman. And in order to become a journeyman, you have to attend 3 meetings, and then you recite the Musgrave ritual. And it's done as a responsive reading, and Steve Chalet is our master of the ritual. Steve's a longtime member. His father was a member of the Copper Beeches. And the number of people that recite the ritual, and it's done as a group, is dependent on the number of people that are at their third meeting. So it can range from anything from 1 to 15. When we had, after we, as I said, changed our membership policy, when we got to the third meeting, there were an awful lot of women and several men who were now at their third meeting. So we had this, it seemed as if 2/3 of the room got up and did the Musgrave ritual. Now, we act as if it's very solemn, and of course you do it from memory, but everybody hopes that you screw up.
Well, I'll tell you, I remember, I've read the Musgrave ritual like 500 times in my life. It seems like, maybe not that many, but many times. I memorized it. I had it down. Then you go to the meeting, and you have a couple of cocktails, and the evening's getting on, and now you've got to stand up, and the pressure's like, It was harrowing.
Absolutely. And everybody screws up, which gives us all a chance to heckle and make noise and make naughty remarks. And that's the fun of the meeting. I mean, I'm probably the poster boy for what's supposed to happen, because I guess it was around 1980. I was at my third meeting, and it was my turn to do the ritual. And I don't remember if anybody did it with me or not. I might have been by myself. But I violated my cardinal rule about public speaking as Sherlockian, which is to don't drink until you sit down. And I'd had a long day at work, and I had a drink. And I got up to do the Musgrave ritual, and I was just terrible. And everybody's heckling me and throwing dinner rolls. And, I just did an abysmal job. And Peter Blau came up to me afterwards and said, "Bob, have you even read the story?" I was so
well,
bad.
That's how I felt. It's like,
oh, yeah.
What am I doing here? I can't even remember the Musgrave ritual.
Right. So the whole point is that we make it a big joke. Now, to take it, though, a little farther, and I talked about that real sense of tradition. So now it's nearly 40 years later, and my son Alex is at his third meeting, and he has to do the Musgrave ritual. Well, Alex, though, has done a great deal of musical theater in his life. So Alex was letter perfect. And when he's done, yeah. No, well, what happened was, now remember, I'd blown it nearly 40 years earlier, but Peter Blau is sitting next to me after this. And when Alex is done, Blau leans over to me, and think about his memory. He says, "Alex was much better than you." So
you must
he
have
remembered.
I'm sorry, Bob. You must have really blown it.
I was terrible, and Alex was just like thespian level work. But Blau remembered, and he couldn't resist to lean over and tell me how much worse I was than my own son. Well, so once you've done the Musgrave ritual and you've survived, we then vote, generally out of pity, to elevate that person to the rank of journeyman. And at that point, you retain that rank until you give a trifling monograph, at which point you are eligible to be elevated to the rank of Master Copper Beechsmith. So after we've done the Musgrave ritual, we like to have usually 2 papers, which are learned presentations. And in spite of all of the heckling and the raucousness and the fun stuff we do, everybody takes the papers really seriously. And we've had just some extraordinary papers. So leading into publications, what you're probably going to ask me is, in the early days of the group, the group published 2 books. The first is called Leaves from the Copper Beeches, and this was published in 1959, and it consists of papers that were given at Copper Beeches meetings, and it ranges from people like Edgar Smith and A. Carson Simpson, some of the T.S. Blakeney, some of the early names of the BSI and Sherlockian world. And this book was a success. It's kind of a nice collector's item. And then several years later, in 1979, 76, the group published again right before I joined, more Leaves from the Copper Beeches, which is more papers given at the meeting. So we've had those 2 publications, and really more recently, one of the benefits of having not only as a member but an officer of our group is the toller is Steve Rothman, who happens to be the editor of the journal that he edits and you publish. And Steve is quite intelligently on the lookout for good papers to publish, and he's scarfed up a lot of the trifling monographs that have been given at Copper Beeches dinners, and they've appeared in the journal. As recently as probably, I just got my current issue, but certainly within the past year, there have been several publications that have come out of Copper Beeches presentations. So there's a long history of publishing that goes to the group, and we're very proud of that.
Well, it is a point of pride. I think for listeners or viewers who are in science societies, it's easier than ever to publish, and I think Sherlockian publishing is one of the great I think it's one of the great joys of the hobby.
Oh,
So I would encourage you all to do it. Take it on. It's fun.
yeah, just do it.
Yeah, what I find interesting about the Copper Beeches is that not only is it a publishing society, but there's a very small number of Sherlock Holmes societies that have had not just published works from their own members and that sort of thing, but actually have had novels written about them.
Yes.
And I can cite them for our viewers. One is, of course, the Baker Street Irregulars, and it begins, the pattern was sort of set with this book by Anthony Boucher called The Case of the Baker Street Irregulars.
A really good book.
It's a great book, really a fun read, and it's a sort of, when was this published? I can't quite remember. Let's see here. I should have looked this up before now.
Late 40s, early 50s?
1940, yeah. And it's a novel about kind of a fictional version of the regulars being involved in a murder. And then the BSI also had a book a few years ago called The Sherlockian by Graham Moore. Not quite as good, truth be told. My own local science society, the Illustrious Clients, also had a novel written about it called The Tulpa, which is a science fiction horror novel. Interesting to read. But also, early came for the Sons of the Copper Beeches came this book called The Copper Beeches
by Arthur Lewis, who was
Yes.
a longtime member of our group. I did get to meet him several times early on in my membership, and I think it's called a roman à clef, basically, where there are real life people who participate in the novel under other names. And it's a murder mystery that involves members of the Copper Beeches. Just to show the fun, you talked to me, we talked at the beginning about science societies and, just the wonderful experiences you have as a Sherlockian in a science society. One of the characters mentioned in the book is a physician, and he's based on Dr. Marvin Aronson, who for many, many years was the chief medical examiner of the city of Philadelphia and a longtime member of the Copper Beeches and the Baker Street Irregulars. And Marv, by definition, because he's a chief medical examiner, is a pathologist, and I'm a pathologist, and I did my training. That's how I ended up in Philadelphia. And his building was next door to the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. So if I'd have a free afternoon, which wasn't too often, but when I did, I'd go next door and watch them do the forensic autopsies. And because I'd met Marv, he'd let me in. And I really got to learn a lot from that association. So I can actually tell you that in the Sons of the Copper Beeches, it is perhaps the only Sherlockian organization, including the Baker Street Irregulars, where two of its members conducted an autopsy jointly. Just for a touch of the macabre. But Marv was a wonderful guy, a longtime member, had a great sense of humor, and he's one of the characters. But it's a fun novel. It really
is. I highly recommend it. It's a great read, and it's kind of a romp,
yeah.
And it's a good time.
And then let me mention quickly, because I don't want to keep us on too long, but the last item is the quiz.
Yes.
And the quiz is based on the story of the evening. And the way it works is that the winners of the previous quiz make up the next quiz. And Chris Zoydan is our quiz master, and he coordinates it. And that's the last thing we do. And the quiz has worked very well for the entire more than 70 years of the Copper Beeches, except once. And it was sometime in the early 1980s. And we'd gotten to, I'm pretty sure it was the Retired Colorman, which again, I think is the last short story printed in the Doubleday edition. And the quiz was won by two young wise guy members of the Sons of the Copper Beeches. So the next story was going to be, go back to the beginning and do a study in Scarlet. And two guys, one named Steve Rothman and one named Bob Katz, won the quiz on Retired Colorman. This was, as I said, in the early 1980s. And we thought we had the greatest idea in Sherlockian quizzes. We thought it would be the greatest idea if we based the entire quiz on the American section of A Study in Scarlet. The name Sherlock Holmes did not appear once in the entire quiz. So out of a total of, say, 25 points, the winner, I think, got 2. Now, remember, this is at the end of a long evening when people had cigars and stuff. And we went into it thinking it was going to be really funny and everybody would think it was cool. And I guess it was the closest we've ever come to a Sherlockian lynch mob. And Jack Coley was the headmaster at the time, and he was the nicest guy, had a great disposition. He was funny. I'd never seen him angry, except that one time when he told Steve and me in no uncertain terms that if we ever pulled that again, we were not going to be Sons of the Copper Beeches anymore. So to this day, we've avoided doing that. But
Bob, we're about out of time, so we probably need to wrap this up. Do you have anything you want to tell Sherlockians that might, be hesitant? Because I know I was hesitant to join a group when I was young. You mentioned that you were. Any parting words that you might want to tell a viewer who's I don't know, hesitant about joining a science society?
I think the best thing I can say, and I think, Steve, you can answer the question, you can comment on this as well, is how many friends have people like us made in the Sherlockian world through science societies? Not just the BSI, but starting in science. How many close friends have we made? And how many times did those begin? Certainly for me, and I suspect for you, literally walking into a room where I didn't know anyone.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Bob.
And
lifelong friends. It's really sort of defined and shaped my whole life.
Yeah, it's the same for me. You and I are both lifers, as Mike Whalen calls people like us. But literally, when I was in 1974, when I went to that meeting of 3 Garrett Devs up in Western, I was 23. I wasn't yet 23. I was 22 years old. I didn't know anybody. I came out of that meeting with addresses and correspondence, and
yes.
No, and they were with people of all ages and stations, and it didn't matter. We share an interest, and so if anybody's thinking about joining a Sherlockian organization, do it. And if for some reason you're not comfortable in the one you join, find another one. As you said, so many Sherlockian organizations are so different in their structure, in their organization, in their makeup. You're going to find a group you like. It's almost impossible not to find a Sherlockian group that you like. So
and it's the great equalizer, it's the great.
Absolutely.
I mean, I know so many Sherlockians. I don't know what they do for a living necessarily. I don't really care.
Well, you often find out years later.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's the important thing. We share a certain, as I said at the beginning, you come for the stories, you stay for the friends.
Yes, exactly.
And really, it's the only organization in the Sherlockian world, if you want to call it an organization, it's the only entity, society, culture, where literally you can walk into a room as a young person, knowing nobody, and people are nice to you, and want to meet you.
So true.
What more can you say?
You can't say anything. That's it. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Great to visit with you, and I look forward to seeing the Sons of the Copper Beeches in person again whenever we're able to reconvene.
Yes, we'll hope to see you in Philadelphia soon. Be well, everybody. Stay safe, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks for being with us. And that concludes this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I want to thank Bob Katz for joining us again, and I'm urging you to tune in next time, 2 weeks from this episode, where we have a conversation with Karlina Dilakova, who is a tremendous Sherlockian. And we'll be talking to her about the curious intersection of her vocation and her avocation. Between now and then, if you have any questions about anything discussed in this episode, or any suggestions for future episodes, or anything at all that you want to convey to us, just ask the question in the comments section of the Facebook page in which you have viewed this program today. And we'll try to answer your questions or respond to them somehow next time. Until then, thank you. Thank you.